Welcome to the Faith Today podcast. I'm Bill Flederis.
And I'm Sammy Trema. Bill, this episode is one that is definitely close to the heart. We're talking about relationship between pastors who may not have the same denominational lines and what the value is of relationship and connecting there. Your guest was Jason Ballard. What were some things that you got into with the conversation?
Jason helped to plant a church in Vancouver, I think about 6 years ago, if I'm remembering right. He says in the episode. Part of the vision for that was really about that it's not just a solo activity, but it needs a team. And
For sure.
we need those friends and those relationships, those of us who are working in ministry, and even, like you said, cross-denominational friendships and relationships, so that you have somebody outside your immediate area of ministry that you can debrief with or get advice from or wisdom from. So he talks a little bit about how that developed, and then it's grown beyond the church that he helps to lead now. It's called The Way Church in Vancouver. There's an organization called the Pastorate that has emerged out of that, which hosts retreats for pastors and also runs a podcast. They have about 175 episodes where they've interviewed Canadian church pastors. Just what's your career been like? What's it like in your church? And so there's lots to learn from, and they have a beautiful approach that is kind of agnostic about your denomination. That is to say, we love it that you're a Christian. It doesn't matter to us so much that you're in that denomination or this denomination, but, let's talk about what we have in common. So it's a beautiful, encouraging episode for people to listen to. I hope they'll get out of it as much enjoyment as I did as a host.
And Bill, I hear the reminder of brotherhood, right? So I can't wait to see what we learn as we listen back to what you talked with Jason about.
Yeah, thanks. Here we go. Well, Jason, it's great to have you here on the podcast. I thought we'd start off with you maybe explaining to our audience a bit what the Pastorate is. Some of our listeners probably know about it, but others, maybe they have no idea. So how would you describe the Pastorate to people?
The Pastorate exists to strengthen pastors. We're responding to a deep conviction that local churches matter for the flourishing of Canada. And I'm sure we all have this in common. We want to see our towns and villages and cities, our country be as flourishing as possible. And I think that when churches get healthy, it transforms cities. And one of the ways that we can see healthy churches is to have healthy, equipped pastors. And one of the challenges we face in Canada is a shortage of equipped pastors. We have a pipeline challenge, and just the weight and responsibility of a pastor leaves pastors very prone to, whether it's seasons or extended chapters of whether it's isolation or overwhelm. And so we keep asking the question, how do we strengthen pastors? And so we do that in a variety of ways. And it came out of a real natural impulse before it was a formal organization, just to gather pastors across denominational lines, across traditional boundary lines within the church, to say, hey, how can we gather, be together, grow together, build relationships? And a few friends and I just began to dream about what this looked like to more intentionally create programs and gatherings and resources that could strengthen pastors and tell the story of the church in Canada. And so that's what we're about.
Awesome. One of the things that I am really struck by when I was doing a bit of research on the Pastorate is that you have this optimism, even though some might say the times for our country or for the church in our country and our society are kind of dim. There's growing secularism, there are churches closing, people are leaving pastoral vocations, and yet your optimism, you're trying to sow seeds of hope.
That's right.
How do you hold on to that in this time? How do you focus on that? How do you grab hold of that and not let go?
It's very sincere. Like, I'm full of hope for the church in Canada. I think there's like a meta answer to that question, that there's an empty tomb and the promise of the return of Christ. And there's evidence of his inbreaking kingdom all around us. So there's this like theological hope. And that's one time I heard somebody talk about hope, at least in the resurrection, is, taking resources from the future, the promise that he's coming again, and letting that fuel us in the present. So that's part of it. But then also my ears to the ground. I'm hearing stories constantly of God at work, churches alive. Like, I see all the data, the research of churches in decline, the challenges we face. I know what we're facing nationally, politically, there's real issues and there's reasons to be concerned. And I think concern rightly held should move us to thoughtful response and action and courageous response. But the living God has not given up on this world or on Canada. And he's very committed to building his church. And so anytime we bring him into the conversation, we've got great reason for hope. And so I also think that sometimes we resort to fear as a motivator, and fear is an incredible motivator. It can make us move quickly. It can cause us to respond courageously. And I think fear, concern is legitimate. But I think in terms of a sustaining motivation for life with God and sacrifice, we also have the resources of hope and the promise of God at work. And as soon as you see, and we all see this, a changed life, somebody finding freedom, somebody coming to know Jesus, sometimes these stories of transformation, stories of the church coming alive, story of a church making an impact in the neighborhood, get lost in sort of the shadows of all of the negative news. And so I think the discipline is to, yes, keep eyes on Jesus, his word, and his promise, but then also to pay attention to the stories. And I think sometimes I feel like one of my jobs as a pastor, and even my work with the pastorate, is to bear witness to what God is doing and to treasure those stories. Like I have a little note on my phone where I just collect little stories from our local church of the way God has moved in someone's life, the way healing or reconciliation or transformation has happened. And I cherish those notes because a lot of days as a pastor, you don't feel that, but you pull those out and you bring them to mind and it reorients your imagination. And I think part of having a kingdom imagination is that it'd be permeated with the possibility of transformation, the possibility of the inbreaking kingdom. Yeah, that's what kind of drives it. I also think that one of the ways that we want to serve pastors is put a little bit of hope and courage in their hearts and their minds. And so we want to be brokers of kingdom hope to pastors across Canada.
Yeah, that's great. That's such a great mission. How could anybody not get excited about that? I see that coming out in one of the programs that you do that's maybe the most visible is the podcast that you produce.
Yeah.
So looks to me like you've got about, when we're recording this, you've got about 175 episodes, and more than half of them, you're interviewing a Canadian pastor of some kind. What are you trying to do with the pastorate then? Like you said, or maybe just elaborate. You were talking about a little bit of courage and a little bit of hope.
Yeah. So with a podcast, there's kind of a few goals. Like one is if we could join the conversation that a pastor or ministry leader is having in their internal monologue with the people around them throughout the week, we want to join that conversation. So we sit down with pastors and ask them about what they're seeing and learning. So there's some sort of, a lower level goal is pass on learnings, pass on ideas. But more than anything, we're just trying to tell the story of the church in Canada. I know that for me, when I hear about God at work in Yellowknife or in Grand Manan, New Brunswick, and I hear about a pastor who's also sacrificing and dreaming and serving, it does something to me here in Vancouver. And so it's one of our real joys and a deep conviction to make a good percentage of our interviews, Canadian pastors, men and women who are serving the church in a geographical diversity, denominational diversity. And it's just such a joy because, you probably have the same experience. I get to go, so tell me about how you found yourself in ministry. Tell me what you're seeing God doing. I love hearing stories of churches. Some friends and I started at our church only 5 years ago. I love chatting with somebody who's pastor in a church that's got like 80 to 100 years of history because you realize that they are doing what we're all doing. They're just picking up the story where it was handed to them, and then they're going to pass the baton to someone that comes after. And when you hear these longevity stories, it helps you zoom out a little bit. And like some of these churches have like some pretty high highs and some low lows, seasons of revitalization, seasons of what some might call renewal and revival. But when you see the story in macro, you see God's faithfulness, his redemptive work, and it does something to, like we're talking about, our hope. And then quietly, the other goal is all these quiet connections emerge from it. Like we'll interview somebody, let's say on Vancouver Island who's doing unique work with the senior community around them. And then what will inevitably happen is somebody will listen, maybe from a similar city or a different part of Canada, who sees the same need in their city. And they might reach out to that person and say, tell me more about that work. And so by sharing these stories, you're sparking imagination and you're actually quietly building tapestry, like relational substructure to the church in Canada. And we just take a great delight in doing that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think for listeners that might not have checked it out, there'll be some familiar names of people that you've already interviewed. I was scrolling through and I saw some names like Daniel Im, Mark Buchanan, Dominic Russo, Preston Puteau, Shayla Visser, Carrie Newhoff, and on and on. And so I love it that you've got this heart for Canada. I think there's something unique, right, about ministry in Canada and telling those stories that are particularly Canadian. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I think that can be sometimes overstated. Like, we have lots to learn from the church in Ukraine right now, from the church in Australia, from the church in the UK, and even the church in the United States of America, But for much of the Canadian story, our primary source material has been the church in the US or wherever it might be. And again, we can learn and glean lots, but I think the cultural experience of life in Canada, the unique challenges, there's something powerful about learning from that, but also a sense of place, a sense of Canadian identity. Again, our primary identity as Jesus followers is not that we're Canadian first. We belong to a new nation that God is building that's multi-ethnic and covers the globe. But I do sometimes feel like the Canadian church lacks a sense of self, a sense of place, and we kind of feel, as a result, lots of things can happen. We can feel unseen. We can find ourselves feeling untethered. And so I think by telling the Canadian story, I think the sensibilities do resonate. I think the realities do resonate. It's more helpful in that way. You can see yourself in that story, but it's also giving you a sense of location, literally geographically, but also in that more sort of abstract sense of location where you can find yourself in a story that's unfolding around you. And I find that deeply important, whether it's our church or my life as part of what God's doing in our country or even in our city. We're one piece of a much bigger kingdom work in our city. And when you get a vision of that, it brings courage. It brings a sense of humility, which I think is important, like that humble courage. I think that's one of the hallmarks of the Canadian church when she's at her best, is humble courage. Humble, like we're not about celebrities. We're not about one name or one place. There's a humility that says that, hey, we're a piece of the puzzle and we're happy to be part of it. But then a courage that also goes, this is worth fighting for. Now, the inverse of that is sometimes Canadians can be passive, lack the good kind of godly ambition. I know ambition's a complicated word, but there's a healthy kind of vision. And so I think that when the Canadian church is at her best, she has a humble courage. It's not trying to put the spotlight on one person or one work, but there is a courage and humility that comes from saying God's at work and we want to go all in and be part of it. I also think Canadians, I think I can say it as a Canadian, is we don't always celebrate one another well. I think it's a fear of maybe a fear of celebrity culture, maybe, or something like that. Some people might call it tall poppy syndrome. Something seems to be going well. We're like, well, let's not let it get to his or her head. And I get the instinct, but I would way rather celebrate men and women who are creatively responding to the needs of our time. Celebrate churches that are experiencing impact in their community, transformation of lives, or even numerical growth. I want to celebrate that. And not in comparison, but to find that humble courage of what we're part of. And I'm seeing that more and more. I think that the Canadian church is celebrating one another better than ever before, learning from one another, and building the kinds of relationships that create the kind of raw material for kingdom collaboration and partnership.
Yeah, I like that metaphor that you mentioned earlier about a tapestry, right? If you think about the tapestry of the Canadian church, and then obviously it's not just the Canadian church, it's the worldwide, universal, timeless church that we're talking about, right? So we get to see our little part and maybe strengthen some of the weave or something, if I can really push the metaphor, in our local area.
I like that.
I know the original name for the pastorate was different. It was called the Canadian Church Leaders Network.
Yeah.
And I think that network word also kind of gets at that tapestry, that weaving, that
Absolutely.
connection thing. Can you maybe tell our listeners a little bit about some of the things that you do to intentionally build relationships among Canadian ministry leaders?
Yeah. One of the ways we do that is we host city meetups. So we pop into different cities across Canada. Over the next 12 months, we'll be in maybe 8 or 9 different cities. And we just gather pastors. Some people drive multiple hours to be there. And, some people, it's right in their neck of the woods. And it's a really eclectic bunch, age, stage, type of church. And usually we spend some time eating some amazing food. So we find like the best pastries, the best coffee we can nearby, because we want to set the table with hospitality and tell pastors that we value you. We think your work matters. And if you're going to give us 2 hours of your day, we may as well put something yummy in your tummy. And then there's usually some sort of like storytelling. Here's some stories of God at work. Maybe something that could actually like pour into them. So that could be an older pastor with decades of experience depositing something in their hearts and minds. And then time to pray and connect with each other. And that's really special. So you see these relationships build through there. We also host retreats, which we really enjoy. We just last week we're doing a retreat. We had pastors from 4 or 5 different provinces who came out for it. And then many of them come with their spouses. And it's like 3 nights and there's tons of spacious time. And one of the things I delight in the most is the conversations after meals where they just linger on and there's real laughter. But then also the ministry, like we don't push this or have to force it. But every single time we do stuff like this, there's little pockets and corners of people receiving prayer or tears in their eyes. And I think something that's special is like when a pastor experiences a safe space with another pastor, no comparison. This isn't just a quick in-passing conversation in a lobby in a networking environment. And you begin to express what you're going through. I think there's this subconscious or conscious awareness that on some level they know what I'm experiencing, and that expedites the trust and expedites the vulnerability. And then to put your hand on that person's shoulder and say, I bless what God's doing in your life. I'm sorry for what you're experiencing. I want to pray for God's help. And then one of the ways we do this most deeply is we have these more long-form programs. So we have 2 programs that actually run over 12 months or 16 months. And that's the same group of pastors spending an extended period of time, some in person, so these retreats along the way, and then monthly meetups on Zoom. And then you're in the same cohort, in the same group, and you're hearing from the same thought leaders or contributors, but then processing it together, reflecting on your experience. And it's just been so special to see because there is a unique role. Like I really cherish the pastoral friendships I have. I have a tapestry, to use that word, or a constellation of meaningful relationships, but some of the ones that are most precious to me are friendships with other pastors. And those don't happen on accident. They require some intentionality. We're all busy, so, invest in those friendships. But when you do experience those, they can be such a great gift. And so we see those emerging all the time. People sign up for our programs because they want to learn something or experience something, but inevitably what they walk away most appreciating is the new relationships they form.
One of the podcast episodes that I listened to getting ready for today had you talking about exactly that relationships that go beyond the bucket that you're creating. You're creating this opportunity that could coalesce, that could start something, that could catalyze a relationship. But you were saying how thrilled you were to have those relationships keep on going independent of your organization. And I thought that was beautiful to see your heart for that.
Yeah, that's the vision. I mean, I was very fortunate before we started the pastorate. There was a group of pastors who actually represented 1 to 4 different countries that would meet once a year for a couple days, do some shared learning, pray for each other, and encourage one another. And then a group chat that kind of extended beyond that. And I was invited into that. And I experienced just such profound resource from those relationships, the sense of commitment. There wasn't someone organizing that for us. It was a few people initiating that. And then I remember during the pandemic, reaching out to a few Canadian pastors and saying, hey, for the next however many months, do you want to just jump on Zoom once a month? And these weren't pastors that I knew very well at the time, but it became like a lifeline during especially those early months of the pandemic, trying to navigate our own experience, but also our church's rapidly changing dynamics. And so what we've seen that we love is, I think if anything, we're trying to make it popular to be in relationship with other pastors intentionally and consistently. And so some of that is fueled by our programs. But at the end of, like, we do a program for young pastors called the Emerging Leaders Lab. So these are pastors, most of them in their 20s or 30s, who have a vision for long-term ministry, maybe even a vision to be a lead pastor at some point in their journey, but they're not in that role now. And the last session that I get to teach is how to lead a peer-led pastoral cohort. So the idea is, you've signed up for this program. We hope it's been helpful for you. But when this program is done, I hope you might continue on. And just 2 weeks ago, got a message from a pastor named Reese from Vancouver Island. And he said, hey, me and a bunch of guys from that group have been meeting on a regular basis. And do you have any advice? And that's a call I love to give, just to say, keep it simple. Don't make it complicated. Don't focus on all about a few tertiary distinctives, but find a place where you can be honest with one another, pray for one another, spur one another on. And so I think those are popping up. It's not a new idea. I know that pastors have been doing that for a long time, but sometimes some of the best old ideas need to be brought back to the surface and celebrated. And so we think a lot about how do we spark and fuel more and more of that happening across Canada. Traditionally, people think about like the ministerial model in a city, and those are wonderful, but they're not always conducive to deep relationship, because often you have a broad group, the gathering points around what's happening in the city, and those are really important and good. But the hope is, like, from an environment like that, a few people could go even deeper than you can go in a group of 20 or 30, where you have a sense of resonance with the people that you're connecting with. And yeah, it's definitely happening more and more, which is fun to see.
That's awesome. So let me just recap this for our listeners, because that's a lot of programs to talk about. So we've got retreats. I'm assuming most of them are held in Vancouver or in BC.
We have a partnership with a lovely retreat center called Barnabas Landing. So the majority we do there because it's just such a wonderful place.
Awesome.
But then the meetups are national, the programs are national, and the podcast, wherever you can find some Wi-Fi, you're good to go.
The meetup is kind of like, you come to a city, let's say, I was looking at your calendar, you've got in April, I think you're going to Winnipeg and Saskatoon, and
Yep.
then in October, you're going to Montreal and Ottawa. And so you're going there like for a day, and any
Yep.
pastors in the area can just come and hang out for a day or two, and you've got a whole nice little agenda for them.
Just a couple hours, actually. It's just like, it's sometimes over a lunch or over
Wow.
between.
Okay.
Yeah, just a few hours. And it's a way for even people listening to the podcast, it's almost like the in-person connection.
Yep.
So those are just little quick sound bites. And then the only thing that wouldn't be online is next year, we're going to host a national conference. And we feel like that'll be an annual rhythm that will move across Canada. And just, again, a national rallying point for pastors and their teams, where there can be a bit more training for their teams, but a lot of that inspiration, encounter with God, refreshment in the Spirit of God, and a sense of, whoa, I'm part of something way more dynamic than I feel most days.
I should have mentioned the other thing, of course, was these cohorts then that we talked
Yeah.
about. So 12 months for the emerging leaders cohort, and 14 months for, what is it called, senior pastor fellowship or
Yeah,
something
lead
like that?
pastors fellowship.
Lead
Yeah,
pastor.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people don't like the word senior. Some people don't like the word
Okay.
lead. We didn't know where to go with that, but
Yeah.
you get the idea.
Sure. Yeah. So all these kind of relationships are happening across denominations. And I think that lines up with the ministry that I'm involved with at Faith Today magazine and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, trying to encourage these kind of relationships across denominations. So it's just thrilling to see that actually happening, and have something that can supplement or complement the traditional ministerials like you're talking about.
Yeah.
One of the things that comes out of these kind of relationships that get sparked seems to be some collaboration at times, even in the area of ministry. One
Yeah.
of the episodes that I listened to, you were talking about another hat that you wear is you're the pastor at a church called The Way in Vancouver. Like you mentioned, it's 5 or 6 years old. And one of the things you mentioned was that you have apprentice pastors that you loan out to other churches in your area to help fill preaching vacancies.
Yeah.
And that's another relationship builder that leads to collaboration. Can you maybe tell our listeners a bit about that?
Yeah. Essentially, as a church, when we were in the journey discerning if we should plant a church in Vancouver, We really felt that we were called not to build a church, but to strengthen the church in Vancouver. And it did mean building a local community with a sense of who we are and commitment to one another. But we've just always been like thinking about how can we serve and help other pastors? And then also how can we do things with? So, we're approaching Easter on Good Friday. We'll do our Good Friday service with 4 other churches in the city: Coastal Church, First Baptist, Church Untitled, Center Church. And that comes out of relationships. I mean, these are pastors we know personally that we spend time with. Almost every Sunday, there's a pastor at a church called Dunbar Heights who texts me, "Hey, I'm praying for you this morning. Here's what I'm
Oh,
preaching on. Can you
sweet.
pray for me?" And so there's the formal stuff, like we're doing this together, but the unseen stuff is the special stuff. All those text messages and coffees. We make a point to do that. And then we also just make a point to go, how can we help other churches when there's need? And we're a church that's needed help. So we are both receiving help in different ways where we have weaknesses. We have a deep bench of developing preachers and communicators. That's one way that we can serve other churches. And I remember during the pandemic, that looked like sometimes helping a church figure out how to get the online thing working. We have a younger team, so that's more intuitive. But for a church maybe that has been around a lot longer, their team could feel like that's less intuitive. How can we help? But the main expression is relationship, trying to have time in the calendar for those coffees, for that time together. And then often what emerges, all sorts of creative initiatives.
Well, I love you being able to share some of these stories on your podcast and other places. I feel like it could be a real source of inspiration for so many other pastors and ministry leaders that are looking to envision kind of ministry that is about being with other churches around, other ministry leaders around, and then strengthening those bonds for the sustainability of a ministry career, right?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the deep bench that you have of younger preachers and leaders, and I'm guessing that's partly from, I'm going to get to another hat that you wear now. There's something that you've got called the Way College,
Yeah.
associated with your church, where you're helping to train people for ministry, I guess.
Yeah,
You want to explain that initiative to people as well?
I'd love to. Earlier, I mentioned this idea of a pipeline challenge. How do we train the pastors of tomorrow? And then we often ask the question too, what kind of ministers will they be? Will they be people who have a high value for God's word? Will they be people who value hospitality and mission? Are they people who, dot, 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 dot. And so we've all been shaped somewhere in some ways. And if we want to see more pastors of courage and conviction and have honed their craft, we need to create a lot of different expressions for that. So we wanted to start a Bible college to train pastors with that expressed purpose. And so we partnered with some institutions that could allow us to do accrediting. And then we built a program that has a couple different expressions where we could do a few things. One is we wanted to move the Bible college experience into the heart of a local church so that ministry exposure and ministry experience is coupled with the classroom. And so, one fun example is we have a philosophy of ministry class. So there's a lecture and there's conversations. But if in that philosophy of ministry class, they're talking about a topic like small groups, these students are experiencing what it feels like to be in that small group and can ask those critical questions. Why do we do X, Y, Z? Why not this? Or if we're talking about Sunday liturgies, they're in the environment. In some cases, that means they're getting opportunities to participate, but it's integrating that. And so we started the Way College really to form pastors. That's our express purpose. So we have a 4-year program that you get an undergraduate degree, and it's a step in the journey towards pastoral ministry. In the coming years, we'll add a master's component to that in partnership with a Canadian institution, which is really exciting. And we're really fortunate just to have wonderful teachers in our environment who've got the ability and the experience to pass on. And then one thing that's really fun is we've started this thing called Everyday Seminary that just extends out of it. So we're able to take some of the experiences that the full-time students have and make it available for anyone. So just a few weeks ago, we did a Saturday in Vancouver on Habakkuk, and Daryl Johnson's one of the pastors and elders at our church and gifted Bible teachers at Regent for some time. And we wanted this experience for our full-time students, but it's easy to open it up. And so we were able to host people from not just our church, but tons of churches from across BC, some people even driving up from Washington for one day on the Old Testament minor prophet Habakkuk. And so we do these things like Everyday Seminary. And then what's really exciting is we've been recording all of these intensives over the last little while. We're going to be able to share them online so people can access it. So it's like we have this deep sort of experience where we're forming pastors in the full program, but then trying to make all of these resources available for the whole church. Because forming ministers isn't just people who are going to do this for their job. I mean, we need the whole church equipped for life and ministry. And so we're having a ton of fun, man. I love doing this. Our team feels like this is like one of our unique callings. And when I say unique, what I mean is not that we're the only ones doing it. Lots of churches are doing this really, really well. But we feel uniquely burdened at the way that one of the things that we're meant to contribute to the church broadly is this ministry equipping journey. And whether that's somebody who's 18, just out of high school, thinking about doing ministry in the future, or in some cases, we have people who have moved here from other countries that did ministry overseas but want to get equipped for ministry in Canada. One of our students is does animation for one of the big studios that produces the movies that we all enjoy and watch. And he's able to still do that job. But because of the favor he has there and the sense of calling to do pastoral ministry, whether bivocationally or switching vocation, he's able to study with us a few days a week. So you've got this huge range of like 18-year-olds through to 40-somethings who are all saying, I want to get equipped for life in ministry and in the local church. And so it's a blast, man. It's a really dynamic environment, and we're really enjoying doing it.
Wow, it sounds super. So great to see God's favor on your initiatives there that you're trying. I asked your admin assistant about numbers, and she said something like you've got 20 students roughly in the Bible college right now,
Yeah.
and then a couple hundred that have gone to these everyday seminary kind of events,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. So yeah, there's about 25 or so full-time students. And so it's small. There's room to grow, but we're not trying to do it massive. Like this is a model that other churches could do, a sustainable way within the ecosystem of a local church where you can really mentor and develop and give ministry opportunity. And so depending on the size of church and the amount of resource devoted to it, you could do a cohort of 5, or you could do it much bigger. But then through the part-time studies, we have, lots of hundreds every year. In the summer, or in the spring rather, we do these week-long intensives. Like this year, we're doing a few different topics on medical ethics, on deconstruction, on revelation, and people will get to be in the classroom environment for full days. And hundreds of people come, and I think there's a hunger for it. But sometimes accessing that theological education or a biblical formation or ministry tools and experience can feel really far away. And so through Everyday Seminary, we're really just trying to open the doors broadly and say, hey, whether this is something you want to do for work, or you're just if you're a follower of Jesus, just wanting to grow in biblical awareness and ministry equipping, you should come on out. And I think there's a hunger now more than I've seen in a long time I think it's because people's faith is there's pressure about what do you believe? And the Bible's a really good book, but it's not a simple book. It wasn't written in our language or our time. And, part of the journey of following Jesus is like getting your head around this stuff. And then not just in your head, but in your heart and then through your hands. And so we're really responding to, yes, the need to equip people, but also a hunger that we're experiencing around us. And surprisingly with young people, it is amazing to see the thoughtfulness and hunger of the next generation for deeper things. And I think that's just a sign of one of the good things God is doing in our time.
Yeah, amen. It's a reason for us to give thanks and praise and to keep working to align ourselves with that. So we've introduced our listeners to a lot of different programs and institutional things that you're involved in. Let me ask you personally, how are you doing juggling all that? What do you do to take care of yourself while you're heading in 7 directions at once?
I think if somebody followed me around for a week, it wouldn't feel as scattered. It's very integrated. I'm talking to you from my kitchen, where the same table we homeschool our kids and share meals with our neighbors. And in the messiness of life, there's a lot of simple, basic patterns that become the like scaffolding, the simple patterns. None of it's innovative. It's quiet time in the morning with God. It's organizing your week with intentional rest. It's surround yourself with people you love and trust you. And then when it comes to kind of the work front, I know it can sound like a lot of things, but all of this is coming from a group of people together that have a singular mission, which is to build the church in Canada. And so, it's like the Way College, the Way Church, the Pastorate, Everyday Seminary, they're all really pointing at the same thing, which really was a journey of us going, let's plant a life-giving church in the city of Vancouver in community. And then from this place, share the resources we can with others. One of the big values of my life and of the organizations that I'm part of is team and friendship. When a team is organized around a clear vision and consistent values, the vehicles of what we're doing and the strategies can change, but it's about what are those values? What's that vision? And so you're saying no to different things, and sometimes there's tension, like where does all the energy or resource go? But it's all so unified around this deep burden to build the church in Canada, to come alongside pastors, to do it locally, and then from that, hopefully have the integrity to do it nationally. And a lot of this emerged about 5 years ago. The seeds of it all have been growing over the last 20 years as a group of friends have been doing ministry in Canada for a long time. That was through ministries like Alpha and different expressions. And I've just found when you find people with a shared conviction and then you negotiate and do the hard work of fighting for those relationships, then in the battle, if you can use that metaphor, you're never standing on your own. And it's incredibly empowering to be doing it with people. And so that's a bit of it. But there are weeks where I ask the question like, okay, I need to renegotiate something. And what I usually find myself having to do is go back to some real fundamentals, which is admit my humanity, realign my schedule around dependency on God, fight for those closest relationships, and let the priority flow from there. I'm just feeling really thankful for a season where I feel more increasingly tethered to life with God and increasingly finding delight in the with God life and a sense of resource from God for the work in front of me, which looks like admitting my humanity, trusting outcomes to Him, and then tucking in real tight to His voice and presence, which gives you the courage to act, but also the courage to stand down in your weakness.
Oh, thank you, Jason. A couple of things that I'm taking away from our conversation and from listening to a couple of your podcasts is that we can have courage to prioritize relationships and not necessarily prioritize, ministry objectives necessarily like institutional things. I really see that in the way that you're prioritizing the things that you're taking on as being important. And then the inspiration that can be to other people to find those relationships and strengthen them. They don't just come to us out of the blue usually. We have to work at them, but to build them and to show how they can sustain a pastoral career or a ministry career or even just a healthy faith life for someone over decades. That's what I'm taking away. Maybe I'll ask you this. For our listeners, what would be your word of encouragement for them as they're listening to this podcast? What would you like them to go away with as an encouragement?
I would love to reinforce the reality that this morning we all woke up in a world God made, and there's so much news, there's so much information that can strike fear, distraction, real trials facing not just the world, but our own country. But this is our Father's world, and He's at work around us, and the kingdom is at hand. And the task is like, those old radios where you got to kind of rock it a little bit to find the right frequency. I find what we need to do a lot is just rock the dial a little bit so that our perception, can we get tuned in to the fact that God's kingdom's unfolding around us, God's at work, and then our invitation is to be with Him in it and then to join Him. And sometimes that leads you to global causes, national causes. We've been talking about that. all of that needs to flow from a deep awareness that that's happening on my street, in my home, right here within me right now. So wherever everyone is listening, God is not far away. The heavens are all around us. He's very, very close. And his kingdom is breaking in. Do you perceive it? Can you hear it? Can you see it? And I think one of the tasks of Christian discipleship or formation is growing in the ability to tune in and see. And very, very practically, sometimes that looks like a slow walk around your neighborhood with God, saying, God, give me eyes to see what you're up to, and then give me the heart and courage to jump in. And so that's my preach to myself today is, Jay, in the midst of this meeting and the next one, just to not get sucked into the vortex of all the things, but to sort of it doesn't mean leaving the things, because we need engaged Christians in the issues, in the times, but just to rock the frequency of self-reliance and chaotic sort of anxiousness into going, okay, God, where are you at in this? And how might I participate?
And part of that tapestry, right? It's a distributed ministry,
What's my part
right?
to play?
With a team, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. I've really enjoyed this time with you, Bill. Thanks for the conversations you're hosting. I think this is really meaningful. I celebrate anyone who's fueling the conversation of the church in Canada, and you guys are doing it. You guys have been for some time doing this and continue to. I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you, Jason, for joining us. We'll make sure to have some show notes for people that they can find the podcast and the way church and college and all of that. So God bless you on your way.
Thank you.
Faith Today. We hope you've enjoyed this intentionally ad-free listening experience. You can help sustain our podcast by contributing to our publisher at theefc.ca/donate.